Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I really enjoyed speaking before and being invited to speak again. As Sarah mentioned, I talk about local procurement pretty much all day long. So I'm going to talk about that today, but I also kind of want to be a little more academic, I suppose, or more theoretical and talk about where local procurement fits in this current I guess, rush in the green transition. And we're talking about raw materials, and everyone's talking about that and wants to access them. But I do think that as practitioners in whether they be a mining company, a consultant, we need to be mindful of where these best practices fit in the wider debates. And that's why I want to talk about local procurement and its role during the green transition and its relation to downstream beneficiation. Um, so just really briefly, I run a program of engineers without borders of Canada called Mining Shared Value. And our entire mission is to push and help the global mining sector increase local procurement and, for that matter, responsible procurement in host countries and communities. And I should say I'm based in London myself. Actually, our whole team is out of London, even though we're a Canadian organization. But in any event, we help, we push when it comes to any actor trying to increase local procurement and responsible procurement by the mining sector. We're there to work with them. But I guess, in some ways I'm a little miffed because everyone is not talking about local procurement right now. They're all talking about downstream beneficiation and making battery components and signing new agreements to refine nickel in other countries. We've seen a lot of countries put in place bans on export of raw materials, and it's essentially a feeling of, I guess, being wrong that it doesn't make sense to export these materials raw. It doesn't make sense to export raw materials that we could be manufacturing into finished goods. And again, there is a bit of a sense of wrong where you mine the product, you send it raw to another country, and then it comes back to you at a higher price in the form of a consumer product. And so, of course, that makes sense. And what's going on now with the forward linkages from mining is that because of this green transition, because of the need for raw materials, copper, cobalt, developing countries rightfully are playing their hand and saying, "Look, you need these minerals. Why don't we get a better share?" And I fully sympathize, and I think it's very fair to say that many of these host countries and communities, to a similar extent in advanced countries, have not seen the benefits of those millions and millions of dollars taken out of the earth beneath them. And so we've seen a number of policy changes, but I would even say at a higher level, if you go to any given mining event, mining in Daba or anything like this, the entire discussion has moved towards forward linkages and critical raw materials and getting those access and turning it into batteries and everything else. And that's great. We absolutely need that. But I want to not just out of self-interest for my own topic, I want to kind of stress some of the pitfalls that come from this surge. And in fact, what I would argue, and I'll argue in this presentation, is that for many countries, and I'll be careful to say most, but most countries, it'll make more sense in the short term to focus on local procurement. And I'll present a couple tools at the end. But first, given the audience, I want to really stress that people who work here with mining companies directly or mining companies who work at them, when it comes to forward linkages, we need to remember that the mining sector is not made up mostly of companies who actually have control over this downstream beneficiation. Freeport-McMoRan is one company that is building a nickel smelter in Indonesia because of restrictions there, and that's actually one of the exceptions to the rule. There has been a very successful policy in Indonesia to some extent, but Freeport-McMoRan is not typical. Most large mining companies do not have control over the downstream beneficiation. Most gold mining companies do not refine their own gold in gold refineries. Those are carried out elsewhere. And so there's a bit of a mismatch between control and influence when it comes to whether forward linkages, the flavor of the day, can be actually influenced by mining companies. Linked to this, because these companies who engage in refining and smelting gold and all these other products they don't usually are they're not usually the mining company, and therefore there's very little public reputational advantage for a mining company to engage in downstream beneficiation unless they own that smelter. So in the case of Freeport, yes, they do own the smelter in Indonesia, and they can brag about that to the government and to the public, but that's not the case with a lot of minerals. And so again, going back to reputation and the how a company can benefit from this surge, there isn't necessarily that much an advantage. Um, and then linked to this, and I think probably the most important in terms of social licenses, downstream beneficiation processes are much more capital intensive rather than labor intensive. And so a smelter does not employ near as amount of the amount of jobs as a mine, and nor does it employ anywhere near the amount of jobs in the upstream goods and service suppliers to that mine. So when we're talking about access to raw materials, the mining companies who want to access deposits and mine, and they want to use beneficent jobs to make the case for their involvement. Those jobs aren't necessarily made in a big way by downstream beneficiation, and most importantly, the jobs that do not take place where the social license matters the most, which is the mine itself. So you're not going to make a smelter in the middle of nowhere where the mine is for lots of reasons, including transportation, but more importantly, because the market access of the finished product needs to have a port or a steady a rail system, which is not necessarily going to be the case in the rural areas where mining takes place. And then again, I want to be really careful here because I am a structuralist in terms of economy. I do believe we should try to change which governments should intervene. They should steer, they shouldn't control, but they should steer the economy to where it should go. That's the historical record. But that said, what is realistic when it comes to forward linkages? It doesn't necessarily make sense for every country to try to be adding beneficiation to their minerals in the host countries where it takes place. There's a very famous quote by Kaplinsky who makes a paraphrase it here, but essentially the skills and capabilities that you use to mine iron have nothing to do with the skills and capabilities required to make pots. It's a very simple point, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about if we are, for example, trying to make battery metals in the DRC. Again, making batteries has nothing to do with mining copper in terms of the skills and capabilities. So I think it's a very perhaps a blunt point, but something that's important to remember. And again, I want to make sure that I'm not trying to say negative things about, but developing in low and high and middle income countries, because the reality is it's not necessarily about the skills and the capabilities of the countries. Australia exports most of its iron raw, even though Australians are among the most educated and high productive people in the world. They export most of their iron raw to China because the markets for steel are in China, not in Australia. Australia doesn't have a giant steel consuming economy, and therefore it's not a knock on Australia that they don't turn all their iron into steel, and they've made many efforts to try to do so with government support, and it hasn't worked per se. And then on the other side, Jamaica exports its raw bauxite because the cost of power is simply too high. It's not a comment on Jamaicans' capabilities or education. The price of power is simply too high in Jamaica for it to make sense to export bauxite into aluminum. And then I think another what I found a really fascinating stat was the number 2 smelter of copper in the world has no mines. It's Japan. Japan is we're talking again about having copper smelters and downstream beneficiation in countries like Zambia, but again, Japan has no copper mines, and yet it's number 2 smelter of copper, and that's because it has all the offtake. It has all the electronics industries who buy that copper. So again, it's about other factors than where the product is. And so that leads me back to my trumpet, which is to say, for the mining sector, and again, I think most people in the call will be sort of people in and around the mining, directly involved in mining. Local procurement is still the way for mining companies to benefit host communities and host countries during the green transition, and the way to secure the social license and smooth government relations. So again, this is my standard slide. about 70% of all procurement spending goes to in-country spending goes to suppliers. This is a World Gold Council stat, but essentially you're looking at a 50 to 70% range depending on the industry. But again, when it comes to benefits, you see government taking 12% here and suppliers taking 71%. So again, if we're trying to influence our access to markets and where we can mine and social license, it makes sense for me to focus on the biggest potential piece of the pie there. And then going back to some of the pitfalls of downstream beneficiation is that local procurement is something that mining companies can change. They have control over the supply chains. They don't have control over the price of electricity, but they do have the ability to make preferential procurement processes to support certain businesses. Likewise, whenever a mining company does engage in local procurement, it's a huge social license benefit and a huge government relations benefit because they're doing the buying. They can make the claim correctly that they have benefited the economy, the jobs and tax revenue it's created. And so again, yes, mining companies should take heed of all these developments around forward linkages, but it's important to recognize that they don't have the ability to influence or to gain credit from some of those developments. And then likewise, as I said, the local procurement simply creates more jobs than forward linkages, and they create them where they matter most for social license, which is at the mine site or near the mine site. And then I think, again, I want to really stress that I'm not saying developing countries shouldn't try for forward linkages, but you should make a step to get there. And one of the steps could be to use local procurement as a means of building the capacities to then be used to make forward linkages, right? And to use a crude example, I won't name the country, but essentially we're working with a country right now where they're seeking to make forward linkages from mining. And the reality is they're not even at this current point making industrial scale food for the mines or basic, metal inputs, say grinding media, bolts, right? So again, you have to ask yourselves, if we're going to try to make battery components and batteries, and we can't make bolts competitively, that seems to be a mismatch. And I think, again, not to say they should try to make the battery metals, but why not start saying, well, let's make the bolts so that we can get better at making, fabrication steel, and then work our way towards things like building battery components. So again, just sort of to provide a tool, a little rant, but just to provide a tool, our freely available tool for local procurement is called the Mining Local Procurement Reporting Mechanism, which we made with GIZ. It is essentially a tool to make procurement transparent, to share more information with suppliers, to empower them, and frankly, to gain credit, to make clear how many dollars are staying in the host community, in the host country. And essentially, it's just a framework that kind of asks you what you spend on local procurement, how you approach it, how you incentivize major contractors to also engage in local procurement, and other quantitative and qualitative information. It's currently being used by, I think this is a bit out of date, but 13 gold mining companies, including Freeport. And again, here's an example of a mining company using it. It's very much like a GRI index, though you don't have to do it this way, but the Lundin Gold does choose to sort of report everything they do on local procurement in the report and then cover where it is in the report like a GRI index. And then finally, I'll just leave again with some concluding thoughts. One being that, yes, we still need to, I don't want to be taken as being sort of a to laissez-faire, let things run. I think governments should try to change their competitive advantage to get into forward linkages, and that's what Japan did. Japan didn't have any copper mines, but it didn't have an electronics industry for that matter, but it put policies in place which made there be an offtake for the copper smelting. So they did change their competitive advantage. So I think companies should try to do that. But leverage does matter. Indonesia has leverage because of its huge nickel supply. It has markets with China. Botswana has leverage over the diamond market because it has most of De Beers diamonds access. So, it's something they could do, and not every country is going to be able to have that kind of leverage to then say demand that lithium be mined and processed in a given country because of downstream beneficiation. So I'll leave it there. I hope this helps the debate and companies engage with stakeholders around the topic. But like I say, in the meantime, local procurement is still the way to go to create social license and benefits.
Love it. Thank you very, very much, Jeff. Everyone, please put your hands together for the wonderful Jeff Geipel. Fantastic.